At exactly 8:17 p.m., the most secure private research facility in the country went completely dark. Not a flicker, not a warning, just silence, and then screaming. 6 black SUVs rolled through the gates without a single shot fired, and within 4 minutes, every armed guard had vanished. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, and staff were trapped inside with no communication, no protection, and no way out. The CEO was surrounded. The research that could change the world was about to be stolen. And the only person who didn't run was a quiet mechanic who fixed broken pipes and never talked about his past. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The maintenance corridor on sublevel 2 smelled the way it always did at that hour. Motor oil, recycled air, and the faint chemical bite of coolant fluid leaking from a joint Mason Creed had been meaning to replace for the past 3 days. He was flat on his back beneath a secondary pump housing, a wrench wedged between his palm and a rusted coupling that hadn't been touched since the facility's original installation, when the lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Out. The kind of out that meant something had cut the primary grid entirely, not tripped a breaker, not blown a fuse, cut it, deliberately, at the source. Mason had worked in enough buildings to know the difference. A power failure announced itself with a stutter, a brief hesitation, the dying hum of machines winding down in sequence. What happened at 8:17 p.m. that Thursday had none of that. 1 second the corridor was lit, the ventilation was running. The faint electrical whine of the security panels down the hall was constant and unremarkable. The next second there was nothing but absolute dark, and the sound of his own breathing. He lay still for 3 full seconds. Then the emergency alarm started. Not the standard tone, the low, repetitive pulse that meant a fire suppression system had been triggered somewhere or a door had been propped open too long. This was the full facility alert, the one Mason had heard tested exactly once during a mandatory drill 6 months ago and had never expected to hear again outside of that context. It was the kind of alarm that meant every security protocol in the building was supposed to engage simultaneously. He rolled out from beneath the pump housing, caught his knee on the corner of the housing bracket, and pushed himself upright in the dark. His flashlight was clipped to his work belt, always. Without exception, a habit so ingrained he didn't have to think about it. He clicked it on and swept the beam down the corridor. Empty. The door to the secondary control room at the far end was hanging open, which it wasn't supposed to be. Ever. Mason stood there for a moment, head slightly tilted, listening past the alarm. Somewhere above him, 2 floors up, maybe 3, he could hear running, not the measured, purposeful movement of trained security personnel responding to an incident. Running. The kind of footsteps that belonged to people trying to get somewhere fast because they were scared. He unclipped his radio from his belt and keyed it. Facilities? This is Creed on sublevel 2. What's the status up there? Static. Clean, flat static that told him the internal communication network was down, not just congested. He tried again. Same result. Mason clipped the radio back, picked up the wrench he'd dropped during the blackout, and stood for another moment in the red-tinted dark. The emergency lighting had kicked in along the baseboards, bathing the corridor in a dim, arterial glow, and made a decision that probably should have taken him longer to make. He went toward the stairs. The Blackstone Horizon Research Complex sat on 47 acres of secured land in a semi-rural corridor between 2 mid-sized cities, far enough from both that the surrounding roads were mostly empty after 6 in the evening. The facility had been built in stages over 11 years, each expansion more ambitious than the last, until what had started as a modest energy research outpost had become one of the most sophisticated private scientific installations in the country. There were 3 above-ground laboratory wings, a separate administrative complex connected by a glassed-in walkway, 2 underground levels of specialized research and server infrastructure, and a perimeter security system that the company's public materials described, without apparent irony, as impenetrable. The woman responsible for all of it was currently standing in the middle of Lab Wing C on the 2nd floor, trying very hard to keep 31 people from making a catastrophic mistake. "I need everyone to stop moving," Sienna Vaughn said, and her voice came out controlled, which surprised her because her hands were not. "Right now, stop." They stopped. Mostly because she said it with the kind of authority that people defaulted to when they were terrified and needed someone to tell them what to do. And partly because Sienna Vaughn had that effect on rooms even under ordinary circumstances. At 30, she had been running Blackstone Horizon for 4 years. Before that, she'd spent 3 years as the company's head of research development, and before that, a physics doctorate she'd finished 2 years ahead of schedule. She was not, by any reasonable measure, someone who panicked easily. But she was also not someone who had ever stood in the middle of her own facility while the security grid was down and 6 unknown vehicles were, according to the last communication she'd received before the radios went dead, inside the compound perimeter. That last piece of information had come from Derek Hollis, her head of security, 40 seconds before contact with his team cut out entirely. His exact words, relayed through the facility's intercom before that too went offline, had been, CEO, to secure location, now. Sienna had not gone to the secure location. The secure location was a reinforced room in the administrative complex on the other side of the facility. Getting there meant crossing 400 feet of exposed exterior walkway, and she had looked out the window of Lab Wing C and watched 2 of her security team's SUVs peel out of the compound's rear access road at speed and unknown, with a certainty she didn't particularly want to examine too closely, that whatever was happening outside those walls was bad enough that trained, armed, professional security personnel had decided leaving was the better option, which meant the secure location wasn't secure anymore. So she'd stayed. All right, she said, looking around the lab. 31 people. Some of them she knew well. Dr. Patricia Osei, the project's lead chemist, standing near the central workstation with her hands pressed flat against the counter like she was trying to keep herself grounded. James Whitfield, one of the younger research engineers who looked about 19 right now, even though he was 26 and had a master's degree. Others she recognized by face but not name. I need to know who has any kind of communication, personal phone, anything. Several hands went up. She already knew the answer would be useless. The facility's signal suppression field, installed as a security measure against corporate espionage, prevented personal devices from accessing any external network inside the building. Standard procedure on a normal night. Tonight it meant they were completely isolated. Okay, she said. We stay together, we stay calm, and we do not open any exterior door without... The window at the far end of the lab exploded inward. Not from an impact, from the shockwave of something detonating outside, close enough to blow the glass inward in a cascade of fragments. Several people screamed. Sienna hit the floor, pulling Patricia Osei down with her by instinct, covering her head with her arms as glass scattered across the tile. Then silence again, except for the alarm and the sound of Patricia breathing very fast beside her. Sienna lifted her head. The window frame was a ragged hole. Through it, she could see the exterior access road and 2 of the black SUVs that had entered the compound, their headlights cutting hard lines through the dark. Men were moving around the vehicles. She counted at least 8 before she dropped back below the windowsill. All of them wearing tactical gear. All of them carrying weapons she couldn't identify from distance, but didn't need to. This was not corporate espionage. This was a raid. Mason came up through the stairwell from sublevel 2 and emerged into the main corridor of the first-floor service wing, and the first thing he encountered was a man he recognized, Garrett Doyle, one of the facility's senior IT technicians, running toward him with the specific expression of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it and was going to be very annoyed if anything slowed him down. Doyle, Mason said. Doyle almost ran into him, stopped, grabbed Mason's arm. You need to get out. Right now. All of us do. What's happening? I don't... Doyle stopped, seemed to recalibrate. The perimeter cameras, the access controls, everything went down from a centralized command. That's not a system failure. Someone killed it deliberately, and there are people inside the compound who shouldn't be here. Armed? Doyle looked at him like he'd asked if the sky was blue. Yes, armed. Mason, I'm not kidding. You need to... Where's Sienna Vaughn? That stopped Doyle. His expression shifted, and Mason watched the man work through something complicated behind his eyes, a quick calculation that involved guilt and urgency and whatever his personal threshold for self-preservation was. Lab Wing C, Doyle said finally, last I heard. But Mason, the security team is gone. Hollis and his guys, they left. I watched them drive out the rear access road. Mason processed this without visible reaction. Any other staff still in the building? I don't know. Some. People are scattered. Doyle's grip on his arm tightened slightly. There's nothing you can do. You're a maintenance guy. You fix pipes. Yeah, Mason said. He said it without inflection, the way a man says something that is technically accurate but functionally irrelevant, and Doyle's grip loosened. Go, Mason told him. The sublevel 2 emergency exit, south corridor. It opens onto the maintenance access road on the back perimeter. Don't use the main exits. Doyle stared at him for a moment. How do you know that? I installed half the doors in this building. Doyle left. Mason went the other direction. The first floor of Lab Wing C's connecting corridor was dark, except for the baseboards, and Mason moved through it quickly with his flashlight angled low. He'd been working in this building for 3 years, long enough to know its layout the way he knew the floor plan of his own house. Instinctively, the kind of knowledge that lived in the body rather than the conscious mind. He knew which doors stuck, which corridors fed into which, where the utility junctions were hidden behind panels that looked like blank wall sections, and which stairwells were used so rarely that the hinges hadn't been oiled since installation. He also knew the blast door. He'd helped install it. 8 months ago, during the facility's last major renovation, a decision had been made at the executive level to retrofit Lab Wing C's primary laboratory floor with a reinforced containment system, ostensibly to protect against accidental breach during experiments with volatile compounds. It was a serious piece of engineering, a hydraulically operated steel door, 8 inches thick, designed to seal the entire laboratory section from the connecting corridor in under 12 seconds. The hydraulic system ran off an independent power circuit that was separate from the main grid, meaning it would still work tonight. Mason was thinking about this as he moved through the corridor, and he was still thinking about it when he heard voices ahead. Multiple people, one of them giving short, sharp instructions, and the timbre of it hit something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not fear. Recognition. The cadence of someone trained to command under pressure. He came around the corner and pushed through the door to Lab Wing C's stairwell, took the stairs 2 at a time to the second floor, and stepped out into the laboratory's outer vestibule. The first person who saw him was James Whitfield, who made a sound like he'd been struck and stumbled backward into a workstation. It's fine, Mason said, immediately and loudly enough for everyone to hear. I work here. Maintenance. Mason Creed. The room was chaos in the way that rooms get chaotic when intelligent people are in a situation none of their expertise has prepared them for. Scientists, Mason had found over 3 years of working alongside them, were exceptionally good at analyzing problems and exceptionally bad at responding to them when the timeline was measured in seconds rather than months. There were small clusters of people behind workstations. Someone had dragged a heavy equipment cabinet in front of the door to the exterior corridor, and at the center of it all was Sienna Vaughn, crouched behind the central workstation island, with her phone in her hand and a cut above her left eyebrow that was bleeding more than it probably felt like it was. She looked up when he came in, and he saw her eyes take him in. The work clothes, the tool belt, the flashlight, and he watched her adjust whatever assessment she'd been about to make. Your maintenance, she said. Not a question. She'd clearly placed him. Chief Mechanic, he said. Mason Creed. Sienna Vaughn. I know who you are. Something moved across her face, brief and complicated, before the CEO part of her reasserted itself. There are armed men outside. At least 8 that I've seen. They have vehicles inside the compound, and I have no communication with anyone outside this building. I know, Mason said. He moved to the window, staying below the sill, and looked out carefully. The 2 SUVs he'd been told about were visible on the exterior access road. A third had moved up, close to the building's entrance. How long since the grid went down? 11 minutes. Okay. He pulled back from the window. There's a blast door on this floor. I know about the blast door, she said. And there was an edge in it, not hostile, just the clipped efficiency of someone managing multiple things at once. It's on the far side of the laboratory section. To get to the hydraulic panel, someone has to go through the main corridor, which is exposed. I know. He paused. I know where the access panel is. I installed it. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way people do when they're trying to decide how much weight to give what someone is saying. "There are people in the main corridor," she said quietly. "Our people." "How many?" "I sent 3 of our technicians out 15 minutes ago to try to get to the server room. I haven't heard from them since." "Which direction?" She told him. He thought about the layout. "The server room access corridor is on the opposite side of the hydraulic panel," he said. "I can check both on the same pass." "You can't go out there alone. Those men have—" "I'm not asking for permission," Mason said. He said it without attitude, just clarity, the way you stated a fact that wasn't in dispute. "I need a radio or a phone that can communicate inside the building, anything." Sienna stared at him for a beat. Then she reached past James Whitfield and pulled a compact handheld two-way radio from the charging dock on the adjacent workstation, one of the internal facility radios that operated on a closed local frequency separate from the main communication system. She held it out. "The main system is down," she said, "but these run off a different circuit, short range, maybe 200 yards inside the building." He took it. Their fingers didn't quite touch. "I'll check in when I reach the panel." He was already moving toward the door. "Mr. Creed," she said. He stopped. "There are drives on the secondary rack by the far window. Research data. If those men get into this laboratory—" She paused, the first real hesitation she'd shown. "That data cannot leave this building." Mason looked at her. Then at the rack she was pointing to, a portable drive unit loaded with what appeared to be 8 or 10 individual drives, each labeled with codes that meant nothing to him and everything to her. "I'll be back," he said. He went out the door. The main corridor of the second floor was not empty. Mason came through the stairwell door slowly, pressed against the frame, and held still. The corridor ran about 90 feet in either direction from the stairwell, lined on one side with laboratory access doors, and on the other with windows overlooking the interior atrium. The emergency lighting was on, dim red baseboards, just enough to see shapes. He saw 3 shapes that concerned him. 2 men in tactical gear were at the far end of the corridor, moving methodically. One was trying doors. The other was providing cover with a weapon that Mason's brain cataloged automatically, without his permission, before he'd finished processing the visual. A suppressed submachine gun, compact, professional grade. Not the equipment of amateurs. Between Mason and the 2 men, crouched behind an overturned equipment cart about 30 feet down the corridor, was a young woman in a lab coat. She was pressed flat against the cart with her knees drawn up, and she was very, very still in the way that people who are terrified get still, hoping that immobility and luck together might be enough. Mason recognized her from the floor directory. Yara Chen, one of the junior research technicians, 23, maybe 24. She'd asked him once to fix a leaking sink in the third-floor break room and had seemed deeply embarrassed about having to call maintenance for something that minor. He needed to get to the hydraulic panel at the end of the corridor. The 2 men were between him and it. He looked at the equipment cart Yara was hiding behind. Looked at the supply closet 6 feet to his left, which he knew from experience was stocked with mop handles, a defibrillator cabinet, and a wheeled steel tool cart that weighed about 200 pounds empty and was currently, almost certainly, not empty. He did some very fast math. Then he crossed the corridor in 4 quick, silent steps, crouched behind the overturned cart beside Yara Chen, and put a finger to his lips before she could make a sound. Her eyes were huge. She was shaking, not visibly, the kind of shaking that lived just below the surface of the skin, the body's argument with the mind about whether staying still was really the best option. "Hydraulic panel," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "Far end of the hall. How many have you seen?" She held up 2 fingers, pointed at the men down the corridor, then 3 fingers and pointed toward the intersection at the other end. 5 total in this corridor. "Can you move quietly?" he asked. She nodded, once, with the conviction of someone who would absolutely be able to do whatever was necessary if it meant surviving. He pointed at the supply closet. "Get in there. Lock it from inside. Don't open it for anyone until you hear the blast door engage." He paused. "You'll feel it more than hear it. The whole floor will vibrate." She stared at him. "Can you do that?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered, steadier than he expected. "Go." She went. He watched her move along the wall, low, careful, faster than he'd given her credit for, and slip into the supply closet. The latch clicked, barely audible under the alarm. Mason looked at the two men at the end of the corridor. Then he stood up, stepped out from behind the cart, and walked toward them. He made it 9 steps before the closer of the two men turned. The man reacted the way trained people react, fast, weapon coming up in one smooth motion, the muzzle tracking toward Mason before the rest of the man had fully registered what he was looking at. "Stop," the man said. British accent, Mason noted distantly. "Hands." Mason stopped, raised his hands. The wrench was in his right hand and he let it hang visible, non-threatening. "Civilian," he said. "Maintenance. I was trying to get out." The man's partner had turned now too. They were maybe 15 feet away. The second man was talking into a headset, which told Mason the intruders had their own communication network running, which was important information. "Drop the tool," the first man said. "Sure," Mason said. He dropped it. The wrench hit the tile floor and made an impressively loud sound, and for exactly the 1 second that both men's attention tracked downward, Mason was already moving. He covered the 15 feet not in a sprint, but in something more controlled than that, closing the distance at an angle that took the first man's weapon out of the equation before the man had fully processed the movement. Mason's left hand went to the weapon arm, not grabbing but deflecting, redirecting the muzzle away and down in a motion that used the man's own startled pullback against him. His right elbow connected with the man's jaw. Not a knockout blow, not even intended to be, just enough to stagger to buy the half-second he needed. The second man was raising his weapon. Mason threw himself sideways toward the large steel tool cart that was sitting against the wall beside the hydraulic panel access door. The cart he had left there 3 weeks ago after a maintenance job and never quite gotten around to returning to the sub-level storage room. He hit it shoulder first and shoved, and 200 pounds of steel on wheels crossed the corridor faster than anyone expected, caught the second man mid-step, and the man went down. Not out, but down and tangled. The first man had recovered and was coming at him with the weapon transitioning to close quarters use, which told Mason he had training rather than just equipment. Mason ducked under the swing, got inside the man's reach, and made it stop. It took 11 seconds total. Both men were on the floor. One was going to be unconscious for a while. The other one, the one who'd been speaking into the headset, was conscious but not going anywhere quickly. Mason took both weapons, cleared them, muscle memory, years of it, and set them on top of the steel cart. He pulled the handheld radio from his belt. "Vaughn," he said. A 2-second pause. "I'm here? I'm at the panel. I need 30 seconds. When you feel the floor vibrate, that's the door engaging." He was already pulling the access panel open as he spoke. A wall-mounted metal housing, unlocked with his facility keycard, exposing the hydraulic control system inside. "Get everyone against the far wall, away from the corridor entrance. The door seals from the corridor side, so anyone in the main lab will be protected." "Understood, Mason." 30 seconds, he said. He worked fast. The hydraulic system was familiar to him in the way that any piece of equipment became familiar after you'd been the one to install it and test it and troubleshoot it. Not intellectual knowledge, just the immediate physical certainty of knowing exactly where every connection was, every valve, every failsafe. His hands found the manual activation sequence without hesitation. He heard boots in the corridor, running boots coming from the far intersection, more of them. He keyed the activation. The system engaged with a sound like something enormous releasing a breath it had been holding, a deep hydraulic groan that resonated through the floor, through the walls, through Mason's feet, and up his spine. The blast door, 8 inches of reinforced steel, began its 12-second descent. He grabbed the steel tool cart. The first of the additional attackers came around the corridor intersection at a run, took in the scene, 2 men down, an ordinary-looking man in work clothes standing beside the door housing, and raised his weapon. Mason shoved the cart. The cart moved the way he'd calculated it would, fast, loud, straight down the corridor. Not at the man, at the space between the man and his partner coming up behind him, creating chaos, creating interference, buying seconds. He ran the other direction, toward the stairwell, as the blast door finished its descent with a sound like a bank vault closing and the entire floor shuddered. Behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of men arriving at a sealed door they had no way to open. Mason took the stairs at speed, one hand on the rail, the radio already at his mouth. "Doors down," he said. Through the radio he could hear, or thought he could hear, the sound of 31 people exhaling at the same time. He found the 3 technicians Sienna had sent to the server room, huddled in a utility alcove on the first floor, alive and uninjured, having made it approximately halfway to their destination before losing their nerve and finding a place to hide. Mason didn't judge them for it. He guided them back toward Lab Wing C through the service corridors he knew better than any of the attackers ever could, using routes that didn't appear on the standard facility schematics because they predated the building's last expansion and had simply never been added to the updated plans. He got them to the laboratory's secondary entrance, a locked door that Sienna buzzed open the moment he identified himself on the radio, and stepped inside. The atmosphere in the room was different now. Still tense, still frightened, but organized in a way it hadn't been before. Sienna had moved everyone away from the windows and gotten them arranged in clusters by the interior walls. Patricia Osei was tending to 2 people who had minor cuts from the blown window. Someone had found a first aid kit. Sienna met him near the door. She had a piece of tape over the cut on her eyebrow that suggested Patricia had already gotten to her as well. "The blast door held?" she asked. "Holding," he confirmed. "But—" He stopped. Something had been sitting at the back of his mind since he'd been in that corridor, something he couldn't quite place yet. He looked around the room, at the walls, at the floor. "You said you know the facility layout." "I've worked here for 7 years. The blast door seals the lab from the main corridor." He was thinking out loud, moving slowly through the geometry of the building in his head. "But there's another way into this section." She frowned. "The exterior entrance is covered. The stairwells—" "No." He turned to the far wall. The wall opposite the corridor entrance. The wall that backed against what should have been, according to the original building plans, solid earth. "There's a maintenance tunnel behind that wall. It was built during the original construction before the wing was expanded. It connects to the utility service road on the compound's north side." Sienna stared at him. "It's not on the current blueprints," Mason said. "It was supposed to be filled in during the expansion, but it wasn't." He paused. "I found it about 8 months ago when I was doing a plumbing survey. The access panel is concealed behind the equipment racks." The silence in the room had a new quality to it now. "If those men have the original construction plans," Sienna said slowly, "or if someone told them—" "Yeah," Mason said. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "But—" "They moved the research drives first," Sienna insisted, and Mason didn't argue. If those drives were what the attackers were after, keeping them away from the most vulnerable point of entry was simple logic. He helped carry the portable rack to the far side of the laboratory, away from the hidden tunnel access, while Patricia organized 3 of the researchers to form a human chain, passing equipment. Then he looked at the concealed panel in the wall and thought about what was behind it. Sienna came to stand beside him. She was quiet for a moment, and he could feel her thinking, running through the same problem from a different direction. "We need to know if they're already in it," she said. "Yes." "And if they are, then we need time." He looked around the lab. His eyes landed on the emergency coolant system, mounted in a heavy steel housing on the near wall, a system he had serviced twice in the past year. "I might be able to buy some." "How?" "There's an emergency coolant release valve tied into the building's containment system," he said. "If I open it into the tunnel access, the coolant vapor will fill the passage. It's not toxic, it's dense and disorienting, and it drops the temperature fast. And the tunnel floor is concrete that slopes toward the center drain. The coolant will make it slick." She looked at the coolant housing, looked at him. "That buys us maybe 4 minutes," she said. 4 minutes is enough time for the containment barriers to engage if someone activates them from the secondary panel." He pointed to the control panel on the east wall. "I need someone who knows what they're doing with that system." Sienna turned. "James?" she said. Whitfield looked up from across the room. "You did your thesis on the facility's containment integration," she said. It wasn't a question. Whitfield crossed the room in 10 steps. He looked at the panel, looked at Mason, and there was something in his face that was terrified and present at the same time. "What do I need to do?" he asked. Mason told him. It was in the end not a clean operation. It never was. The coolant release worked. He could tell from the drop in temperature and the hiss that came through the wall. But one of the attackers made it through the access panel before the barriers engaged, stumbling into the laboratory half-blind and disoriented, and Mason had to handle him the old-fashioned way while James held the barrier switch and Patricia pulled two terrified researchers out of the line of movement. The man was on the floor, cuffed with a zip tie from Mason's tool belt, before most of the room had fully registered what had happened. Mason stood over him, breathing harder than he would have liked, his left side aching where he'd caught a glancing impact against the equipment rack. He looked at Sienna. She was looking at the man on the floor and then at Mason, and her expression was complicated in a way he didn't have time to analyze. "I need to get to the external emergency transmitter," he said. "Sublevel 2, South Corridor. It's a hardwired unit that bypasses the facility's suppression field." "The police?" she asked. Tactical response. "It'll take them 20 minutes minimum to reach this location." He picked up the zip tie man's radio, the intruder's internal comm unit, and held it to his ear. What he heard was confusion, voices cutting over each other in ways that suggested the plan had stopped going according to plan. But they're coming unraveled out there. Whatever they expected tonight, it isn't this. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. "Go," she said. He went. The sublevel 2 corridor felt like a different world, quiet, empty. The alarm still cycling, but somehow more distant down here. The red emergency lighting giving everything the quality of a fever dream. Mason moved through it quickly, past the pump housing where he'd been working when all this started, past the secondary control room with its still-hanging door, down to the south end of the corridor where the external emergency transmitter was bolted to the wall in a housing he had to unlock with a specific key on his facility keychain. He unlocked it. The unit was old, older than the facility, it felt like, a hardwired box that connected directly to a buried line that ran under the compound perimeter to a relay box on the public utility pole near the main road. He'd always thought of it as a relic, a leftover from an earlier era of security planning that had never been updated because updating it would have required digging up a significant amount of landscaping. Tonight he was grateful for the laziness of whatever contractor had decided not to bother. He activated the transmitter. It sent a single coded signal, facility emergency, all responders. And then he stood in the red-lit corridor and listened to the distant, muffled sounds of his own building and thought about his son. Ethan was at his grandmother's tonight. He always was on Thursdays. It had become routine after the accident, after Mason had taken the job here and started working the late maintenance shift, a way to ensure Ethan wasn't alone during the hours when Mason might not make it home until 9 or 10. The boy was 8 years old and knew more about being patient than most adults Mason had known. He left Mason notes sometimes, small pieces of paper tucked into his lunch bag or his toolkit. They were usually just drawings, rockets mostly, and occasionally a figure that was identifiable as Mason by the wrench it was holding. Mason had the most recent one folded in his wallet. He thought about it now, standing in the sublevel corridor while the emergency transmitter hummed its coded signal out into the night, and he let himself think about it for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he went back upstairs. The police tactical unit made it in 17 minutes, which was faster than Mason had predicted and slower than he'd hoped, but exactly fast enough. By the time the first vehicles arrived at the compound perimeter, Mason had guided the laboratory group to the sublevel 2 emergency exit, gotten them out to the maintenance access road, and positioned himself at the facility's secondary entrance to flag down the response teams before anyone made a mistake about which people inside the compound were the ones who needed stopping. It was chaotic. It was loud. There were 4 separate containment actions happening simultaneously as the tactical team swept the facility, and at one point someone who hadn't gotten the full situation briefing briefly pointed a weapon at Mason before a lieutenant physically moved it away and said, with considerable emphasis, "He's the one who called it in." They found the attackers in stages. The 2 men Mason had disabled in the second-floor corridor, still there. The ones trapped behind the blast door, who had been trying unsuccessfully to breach it for 20 minutes. The team in the tunnel, tangled in the containment barriers, amid a cloud of dissipating coolant vapor. The last one they found was not an intruder. He was a man named Gerald Park, the facility's chief operations officer, who had been attempting to leave the compound in a company vehicle when the tactical units arrived. He had in his possession 2 external hard drives and a phone displaying communications Mason couldn't read, but the officers clearly recognized because the expression on the lieutenant's face went through several stages before settling into something flat and professional. Gerald Park had been with the company for 11 years. Sienna Vaughn, standing 15 feet away when they detained him, said nothing. Mason watched her face and saw something he recognized. Not surprise exactly, more like the moment when a suspicion you've been refusing to name becomes a fact you have to live with. It was a different kind of pain than what she'd been carrying for the last 2 hours, and in some ways it looked worse. Park looked at her as they walked him toward the transport vehicle. He didn't say anything either. She turned away first. It was 11:42 p.m. when the facility was finally secured and Mason sat down on the concrete barrier at the edge of the maintenance access road. His left side hurt more than it had an hour ago, which was probably not a great sign, and his hands were shaking slightly in the way hands did when adrenaline had been metabolized and the body was presenting its bill. He hadn't eaten since noon. He was thinking about this. Food, specifically, the leftover rice and chicken in his refrigerator that he'd been planning to eat for dinner, when Sienna came and sat down on the barrier beside him. She had a blanket someone had given her from an emergency kit draped over her shoulders, and the tape on her eyebrow had been replaced by a proper bandage. She sat without saying anything for a moment. "You were a mechanic," she said finally. Not accusatory, just working something out. "I am a mechanic," he said. Before that, he looked at the compound. Activity everywhere. Officers, forensic teams, the facility's own remaining security staff who had started arriving in the last hour from wherever the initial alarm had scattered them. "Before that was a long time ago," he said. She nodded. "Let that sit." "The data drives," he said. "They're intact?" "Yes. Patricia confirmed all units are accounted for." He nodded. "Mr. Creed," she started. "Mason." "Mason." She paused. 47 minutes. That's how long you were operating in there before the transmitter connected. Alone. She stopped again, and he could hear her choosing words carefully. "I've dealt with a lot of people in this company who talk about what they would do in a crisis. You didn't talk." He thought about Ethan's drawings, about rockets and small paper notes. "I had somewhere to be," he said. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her, but he could feel it. "I have a son," he said, by way of explanation. "He's 8. I told him this morning I'd be home by 10. The compound was lit up now, floodlights and tactical lighting turning the night into something almost resembling day. Somewhere inside, a generator had kicked on, and the facility's exterior lights had come back to partial life. Mason pushed himself off the barrier, felt the complaint from his left side, ignored it. "I'm about 2 hours late," he said. "I should go." He walked toward the main gate. Behind him, he didn't hear her move, and he didn't look back. The night air outside the compound was cold and quiet and smelled like wet grass and exhaust from the police vehicles. His truck was in the staff parking lot, right where he'd left it this morning. He got in, sat for a moment in the dark, and called his mother-in-law. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake. "Ethan's asleep," she said before he could speak. "Good," Mason said. "Are you okay?" He thought about it honestly. His side hurt. His hands had stopped shaking. He was very hungry and extremely tired, and his truck smelled faintly of the motor oil he'd tracked in from the sublevel corridor. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." He started the engine and drove. Mason's mother-in-law, Ruth, had left a plate of food covered in foil on his kitchen counter. He found it when he got home at midnight. Chicken and rice, the same thing he'd been thinking about in the sublevel corridor, which struck him as either a coincidence or just the way his life operated. He stood at the counter and ate it cold without bothering to heat it up, because heating it would have required more decisions than he had left in him, and looked at the drawings Ethan had taped to the refrigerator door over the past month. Rockets. A lopsided dog they didn't own. A figure holding a wrench that was nearly as large as the figure itself. He showered. He found in the shower that the bruising along his left side was worse than he'd estimated. A mottled purple-green expanse from his lower rib to his hip that would make bending uncomfortable for the next week. He stood under the hot water longer than he needed to and tried not to think about Gerald Park's face as they walked him to the transport vehicle. He didn't sleep well. This was not unusual. At 6:15 in this morning, Ethan came through the front door with Ruth behind him, carrying a backpack and wearing the expression of a woman who had watched the news and had things to say, but had decided, for now, to hold them. Ethan ran straight at him, which was also not unusual, except that this morning Mason caught him and held on a beat longer than normal, and Ethan, who was 8 and perceptive in ways that sometimes unsettled people who didn't know him well, went still in his arms for a moment. "You're home," Ethan said into his shoulder. "Told you I would be," Mason said. Ruth set the backpack down by the door. She was looking at the bruise that was visible above the collar of Mason's shirt, because he'd forgotten to button it all the way, and her expression had shifted from held-in concern to something more specific. "Mason," she started. "I'm fine," he said. "That's not what the news is saying. The news doesn't know what happened. They know something happened." She crossed her arms. "They're showing pictures of the facility with police tape and tactical vehicles and Ruth," he said it gently. "I'm fine. We can talk about it later. Not right now." She looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at him many times over the past several years, measuring something, checking something, the same assessment she'd been running since the day her daughter brought him home, and that hadn't stopped even after her daughter was gone. She'd extended it to cover Mason, the way people extend an umbrella to someone standing beside them. "Eat breakfast," she said finally. "Both of you." She left. Mason set Ethan down and looked at him. Ethan was looking back with dark, serious eyes that were his mother's eyes, and a face that was otherwise mostly Mason's. And he had his head tilted slightly, the way he did when he was thinking something through. "Were you at the place on the news?" Ethan asked. "Yeah." "Were you scared?" Mason considered the question honestly. "A little, yeah." Ethan nodded, apparently satisfied by this. "Okay," he said. Then, "Can we have eggs?" The phone call started at 8. The first was from a number he didn't recognize. Turned out to be a facility administrator asking him to come in for a debrief with the police investigation team. He said yes. The second was from the union rep for the facility's maintenance and operations staff, which was less expected but made sense in retrospect. The third, which came while he was still on with the union rep, he let go to voicemail. That one was from Sienna Vaughn's office. He called back after Ethan was settled in front of the television with a bowl of cereal, because on days after everything went wrong, some television was acceptable, and Mason was prepared to defend this position to anyone who wanted to argue it. The call was answered by an assistant who sounded young and carefully composed and asked him to hold, and then Sienna was on the line. She sounded like she hadn't slept either, which was the first time he'd heard her sound like anything other than fully operational. "Mason, thank you for calling back." "Sure." "How are you?" She stopped. Started again. "I'm calling because I want to ask you to come in this afternoon, if you're able. There's a debrief with the federal investigators, and they specifically requested your presence. But there's also, I'd like to speak with you separately, before the debrief, if that works." "What time?" 2 o'clock? "I can have someone pick you up if I have a car," he said. A brief pause. "Right, of course." Another pause, different in quality from the first. "Mason, I also want to say what you did last night. I've been trying to find the right—" She stopped again, and he heard the same thing in her voice that he'd seen in her face on the access road the night before. Someone who was used to having the right words and was currently running short. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to. I want to." He waited. "Thank you," she said, "for not running." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "I'll be there at 2, and hung up. The Blackstone Horizon compound looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, the way places always looked smaller when you could see their actual edges instead of imagining them in the dark. Police tape cordoned off sections of the parking area and the north perimeter near the tunnel access. A van with federal markings was parked near the main entrance. 2 news vehicles were stationed at the public road outside the main gate. Cameras pointed at the compound from a distance. Mason drove past the news vans without slowing down and showed his facility ID at the gate checkpoint, where a uniform he didn't recognize waved him through after a phone call he couldn't hear. The lobby was quieter than he'd ever seen it. The security desk was staffed by 2 officers he didn't recognize, and the usual ambient noise of a working facility, the hum of equipment, The distant voices of staff moving between wings was absent. The building felt like it was waiting for something. He was directed to the administrative wing, which he'd been in exactly twice in 3 years. Once when he was hired, and once when a pipe had burst in the executive bathroom and he'd been the one to fix it. The corridors up here were carpeted and better lit than the maintenance levels, and the coffee smelled different. Not the burnt industrial smell of the break room carafe, but something more expensive, from a machine that probably cost more than 2 months of his salary. Sienna's assistant, who turned out to be a young man named Oliver, with the careful demeanor of someone who had recently witnessed a great deal of stress and was managing it through extreme professionalism, showed him to a conference room and offered him coffee. Mason accepted it because he hadn't slept, and the drive over had not done anything for his alertness. He was alone in the conference room for 4 minutes, which he spent looking out the window at the compound's interior courtyard and the visible corner of Lab Wing C before the door opened. Sienna came in alone. She was in a dark blazer, hair pulled back, and the bandage on her eyebrow was the only visible evidence of the previous night. But she looked the way people looked when they'd been awake and functioning for 30-something hours on whatever combination of necessity and caffeine had gotten them there. She sat down across from him, set a folder on the table and didn't open it. "Before we get into the formal part," she said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to tell me the truth even if you think it's not what I want to hear." "Okay. Last night, in the corridor, the 2 men you, she paused, choosing the word, "subdued. Did you sustain any injuries beyond what I saw?" He hadn't expected that to be the first question. "Bruised ribs, nothing broken. Have you seen a doctor?" "No. I'm going to arrange for our medical staff to—" "I'm fine," he said. "It's bruised ribs. I've had worse." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that wanted to push back and decided against it. "All right." She opened the folder. "The Federal Investigation Team has identified 14 individuals who participated in last night's operation. 11 are in custody. 3 are still being located." She slid a document across the table. "Gerald Park is cooperating with investigators. He's been in custody since approximately 1 a.m. Mason looked at the document without picking it up. It was a summary sheet, names and roles. "How long?" he asked. She understood the question. "The investigators believe Park began making contact with the buyer 18 months ago. The facility blueprints, including the original construction plans with the maintenance tunnel, were sold approximately 6 months ago." She paused. "The tunnel was in the original plans, the ones that predate the renovation. So he didn't know I'd found it?" "No." She closed the folder. "No one knew you'd found it." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a bird landed on the courtyard wall, sat for a moment, and left. "What was the target?" Mason asked. "The drives? The research?" "The prototype data and the research drives, yes, but more specifically—" She paused, and he had the impression of someone making a decision about how much to say. "The clean energy project is further along than we've publicly disclosed. The prototype has been running at operational capacity for 4 months. The data on those drives represents 4 years of research that nobody else in the world has managed to replicate." She looked at him directly. "It would have been worth a great deal to the right buyer, or the wrong one." Mason sat with this. "Park knew the timeline," he said. "He knew the research was ready." "Yes. So last night was always going to be last night, or something like it." "Yes," she said, and something in her voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation. "Eventually." "Yes." He nodded. He understood the specific weight of having trusted someone for years and finding out the trust had been misplaced the entire time. He didn't say this. Some things didn't need to be named. "The debrief is at 3, Sienna said. "The investigators will want a full account of your movements through the facility, timeline, what you observed, the sequence of actions. They'll record it. It'll take a while." She looked at him. "Do you need anything before then? We have about an hour." "I'm fine." She nodded, but didn't move to end the conversation. She folded her hands on the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to anyway." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, and gone almost immediately. "Why maintenance? After whatever you did before?" He'd expected this question eventually. It was the question everyone eventually got around to if they had any curiosity at all, and Sienna Vaughn had made her career on curiosity. "I wanted a job where I could fix things," he said. "Things that stayed fixed." She looked at him. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Accident. I had a son who was 4 years old. I needed work that had regular hours and didn't require me to be somewhere I couldn't leave." He paused. "Maintenance work, you show up, you find out what's broken, you fix it, and when you go home, it's still fixed. That suited me." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. About your wife?" "Yeah." He looked at the window. "She was an engineer, actually. Materials science. She would have been interested in whatever you're building here." "What was her name?" "Claire." Another pause, longer. Sienna didn't fill it with condolences or further questions, which he appreciated. She seemed to understand that some statements were complete and didn't need anything added. "You have a son," she said. "Ethan. He's 8. Does he know what happened?" "He knows I was at the place on the news. I told him I was okay." Mason shrugged. "That was enough for him." "That was enough for him," she repeated, like she was thinking about what that meant. The debrief with the federal investigators ran nearly 2 hours. There were 3 of them, 2 from a federal investigative division, whose exact title Mason didn't catch, and one who introduced herself as a cybersecurity specialist from a government contractor the facility had apparently engaged after the incident. They were thorough. They asked the same questions multiple ways, which was standard practice, and which Mason recognized from his own military experience on the receiving end of after-action reviews. He told them what he knew in the order he knew it. The sequence in the corridor, the positions of the men he'd observed, the tunnel discovery, the coolant system, the timeline of the blast door activation. They were particularly interested in the tunnel, how he'd found it, when, whether he'd told anyone, who else might have known about it. "I mentioned it in a maintenance log," he said. "About 8 months ago. Standard notation, potential structural liability, recommending assessment before the next renovation phase." "Who would have had access to that log?" the lead investigator asked. "Anyone in facility management above a certain level." The investigator looked at his notes. "Including the chief operations officer." "Including him, yes." The investigator made a notation. "Mr. Creed, in your estimation, if you had not been in the facility last night, if the only personnel remaining had been the scientists and the CEO, what would have been the likely outcome?" Mason considered the question without softening it. "The drive data would be gone, possibly some of the researchers as well, depending on whether the intruders were prepared to leave witnesses." The investigator nodded, wrote something. Mason drove home in the early evening, when the light was going orange and the compound was already behind him and the road was ordinary and empty. His side ached from sitting in the conference chair for 2 hours, and he was tired in the specific way that came from being extremely tense for a long period, and then being required to be precise and verbal for another long period immediately after. He picked up Ethan from Ruth's house on the way home. Ethan was full of a story about something that had happened with his friend Marcus and a model airplane and a fence, which Mason listened to with genuine attention because it was exactly the kind of story that required nothing from him except to be present and follow along. And that was, right now, the easiest thing in the world. "And then Marcus said it wasn't his fault," Ethan concluded. "But it was. It was definitely his fault." "Sounds like Marcus needs to work on taking responsibility," Mason said. "That's what I said." Ethan paused. "Well, I didn't say it like that. I said, you broke it, you fix it." "Same idea." Ethan seemed satisfied with this. He ate dinner without complaint and went to bed at a reasonable hour, and Mason sat on the couch afterward in the quiet house and looked at his phone. There was a text from the union rep with a follow-up about the incident. There was a message from the facility HR department about scheduling a trauma support consultation, which he wouldn't go to but appreciated in the abstract. And there was a message from a number he'd added to his contacts that afternoon, because it had called enough times to justify it. The message from Sienna's number said, "The investigative team confirmed this evening that the research data is fully intact and secured. I also wanted you to know the 3 remaining individuals from last night were located and taken into custody approximately an hour ago." It's over. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down on the couch cushion and looked at the ceiling. It was over. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet. The kind of night he had had a way of not being over even when it was technically over. It lived in the body for a while, in the left side bruising and the too light sleep and the way his brain ran incident reviews at odd hours, checking decisions the way you checked locked doors. But the research was safe. Ethan was asleep in the next room. The 3 outstanding individuals were in custody. He typed back, "Good. Thank you for letting me know." He almost left it there. Then he added, "Get some sleep." He wasn't sure why he added it. He sent it before he could think about it too much. And then he put the phone face down on the coffee table and went to check on Ethan one more time before turning in himself. Ethan was asleep on his side with one arm hanging off the bed, which was how he always slept. Mason adjusted the blanket and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark, and then went to bed. 3 days passed. They were strange days. Not bad exactly, but strange in the way that days after a significant event were strange. The world continuing its regular operations while something in you was still partially occupied elsewhere. Mason went back to work on the second day because the facility had reopened its non-affected sections, and because staying home had its own particular difficulty. Too much quiet, too much time to run the review. The facility was different, quieter in some ways, louder in others. There was construction noise from the north perimeter where crews were sealing the maintenance tunnel permanently, and there were federal presence vehicles in the parking lot that hadn't been there before. And the staff who'd returned moved through the corridors with a self-consciousness that would take weeks to wear off. But the work was the same. Quote, "A pressure sensor in the sub-level 1 utility room had been throwing false readings since the night of the incident, probably jostled by the vibration from the blast door engaging. Mason spent a morning diagnosing it and an afternoon replacing the faulty component and recalibrating the system. And by 4 in the afternoon, it was reading accurately, and he logged the repair and moved on to the next item on his list. He was in the middle of replacing a corroded valve fitting on the 3rd floor when Oliver, Sienna's assistant, appeared at the end of the corridor. "Ms. Vaughn would like to see you," Oliver said, "when you have a moment." "Give me 10 minutes, Mason said. It took him 12 because the fitting was stubborn, and leaving it partially done was not something he was going to do. He put his tools away, washed his hands in the nearest bathroom, and followed Oliver to the administrative wing. Sienna's actual office was not something he'd seen before. It was a corner office with windows on 2 sides, and it was messier than he'd expected. Papers stacked in specific-looking disorder, a whiteboard on the interior wall covered in equations and diagrams that he recognized as physics notation without being able to parse the meaning, 2 coffee mugs that appeared to both be in active use. She was standing at the whiteboard with a marker when he came in, and she put the marker down but didn't erase what she'd been working on. "Close the door," she said. He did. She gestured at the chair across from her desk. He sat. She sat. "I've been talking to the board," she said without preamble. "As of this morning, Derek Hollis and his entire security team have been formally terminated. The board is also reviewing the structural decision that allowed a single executive to have access to the level of classified information Park had." "That's good," Mason said. "It's necessary. It's also—" She stopped. "It's complicated. The investigation is ongoing, and there are people on the board who are more concerned about liability and optics than about what actually has to change. That's a fight I'm in the middle of." She paused. "But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about." He waited. "I want to offer you the Director of Safety and Security position," she said. "The role that Hollis should have been doing properly. Rebuilt from the ground up. It would involve restructuring the entire security and emergency response framework for the facility. New protocols, new personnel, direct oversight of both physical security and facility safety integration." She looked at him steadily. "It would involve a significant pay increase, regular hours with some on-call requirements, and direct reporting to me." Mason looked at her. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "You're a former U.S. Navy SEAL with specialized training in facilities operations and tactical response who spent 3 years learning this building from the inside out while everyone above you was managing risk on paper," she said. "I did some reading after the investigators confirmed your service record. You ran a background check. I have one on file. I looked at it more closely than I did when you were hired." She didn't apologize for this. "Mason, I'm not asking because I feel like I owe you something, even though I do. I'm asking because the person I need for this role just proved they can do it under the worst possible conditions." She paused. The job you've been doing is important. So is this one. I'm not telling you your current work doesn't matter. He looked at the whiteboard. The equations. The diagrams that meant something to her and nothing to him, except that whatever they represented was apparently worth protecting seriously. I have a son, he said. The hours would have to be workable. We'll make them workable. I'd want approval over any personnel brought onto the security team. I'm not inheriting Hollis's choices. Agreed. And I'd want a full review of every access protocol in the facility before I start making structural changes. I need to understand what the actual vulnerabilities are, not the ones someone already identified. Sienna looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. That's the most thorough negotiation I've had in this office in about a year, she said. I wasn't negotiating, he said. Those are conditions. Something shifted in her expression, subtle, but there. Yes. Agreed. All of it. He looked at his hands. They were clean. He'd washed them. But there were calluses on his palms that 3 years of maintenance work had put there, and that wouldn't go away regardless of what his job title became. Can I have a couple of days? He said. Of course. He stood. She stood. Mason, she said as he reached the door. For what it's worth, I think she would have liked knowing her husband kept people safe. He stopped, turned slightly. She was looking at him without apology, the way she'd delivered most things, directly, because she apparently decided that directness was more respectful than tact. He didn't say anything for a moment. Yeah, he said. She probably would have. He went back downstairs. The corroded valve fitting was still waiting for him, and he picked up his tools and got back to work because the work was in front of him and it still needed doing, and that, for now, was enough. He took 2 days. On the first day, he didn't think about it, or tried not to, which amounted to the same thing in reverse. He took Ethan to the park in the morning, and they threw a baseball back and forth until Ethan's arm got tired and he wanted to talk about rockets instead. And Mason sat on the bench and listened and watched his son move his hands through the air, demonstrating trajectories, and thought about the whiteboard in Sienna's office with its equations that he couldn't read. On the second day, he called his brother-in-law Danny, who was the closest thing he had to someone who would tell him the truth without being careful about it. Director of Safety and Security, Danny said, after Mason had explained. Yeah. At the place where you basically saved everyone's lives. I wouldn't describe it like that. How would you describe it? I did what needed doing, and the circumstances happened to line up. Danny was quiet for a moment. Mason, man, take the job. I'm thinking about it. What is there to think about? You're a 47-year-old 37. 37-year-old Navy SEAL who's been fixing leaky pipes for 3 years because you needed something stable after Claire. That's understandable. That made sense. But Ethan's 8 now, not 4. And if this woman is offering you a job that fits what you actually are, that seems like it's not about what I am, Mason said. It's about what works. And this doesn't work? He didn't answer right away. It would change things, he said finally. Things need changing, Danny said. Not unkindly. He called Oliver the next morning and left a message accepting the position because calling Sienna directly still felt like something he needed to work up to, which was its own kind of information that he chose not to examine closely. The transition took 3 weeks, which was faster than it should have been and slower than Sienna wanted. Mason understood both sides of this. The board was nervous, the federal investigation was still active, and the facility's operational security in the interim was being handled by a contracted firm that was adequate and no more. 3 weeks of adequate was 3 weeks of exposure, and Sienna's tolerance for exposure had dropped to approximately 0 the night she'd watched her security team drive away. His first official day as Director of Safety and Security was a Tuesday in early November, and it started badly. He arrived at 7:15 to find that the contracted security firm had, the previous evening, failed to log 2 after-hours access events in the administrative wing. Not breaches, both turned out to be staff working late, but unlogged and therefore invisible until Mason pulled the raw access data himself. He spent the first hour and a half of his first day writing a formal termination notice for the contracted firm's engagement and a memo to Sienna outlining the incident and his recommended timeline for replacing the interim coverage. Sienna read the memo in 20 minutes and called him directly. "You want to terminate them today?" she said. "I want to terminate them yesterday. Today is what I have. If I terminate them today, we have no security coverage at all until I have 3 former military contacts I've already been in touch with informally. 2 of them can be on site by this afternoon. They're qualified. I'll vouch for them personally." A pause. "You've already been talking to people about this." "I've been the director for 2 hours. I started thinking about the coverage gap a week ago." Another pause, different in quality. "All right, send me their information and I'll have HR fast-track the paperwork. I need sign-off authority on all security personnel. We discussed this." "You have it. Send me the information, Mason." He did. By 4 that afternoon, 2 of the 3 contacts were on site. The third arrived the following morning. The contracted firm was out by end of day, and Mason spent the gap personally doing rounds of the facility perimeter with the 2 new arrivals, walking them through the layout, the access points, the specific vulnerabilities he'd identified during his own 3 years in the building. "The north tunnel is sealed," he told them, "but the seal needs to be inspected every 2 weeks. The construction crew did good work, but good work settles." He stopped at the corner of Lab Wing C's exterior wall and pointed. "This section of fencing is original installation from 12 years ago. The post anchors have surface corrosion. It's structural, not cosmetic. It means the tensile rating is lower than spec. I've submitted a replacement request to facilities, but until it's done, this is a soft point." The 2 men, both former Army, both named something that ended in a consonant, which Mason noted was an interesting coincidence, made notes. "You did the renovation work here?" one of them asked. "Maintenance, 3 years. Explains why you know where all the bodies are." That's one way to put it. The investigation's formal findings were released internally in the 4th week of November. Mason received a copy through Sienna's office, a dense document, 43 pages, that outlined the scope of Park's cooperation with the external buyer, the timeline of the data theft and planning, and the security failures that had allowed the operation to proceed as far as it did. He read it in one sitting, at the desk in his new office, which was adjacent to the main security station on the 1st floor, not in the administrative wing because he'd specifically requested it. He wanted to be where the access points were, not where the carpet was nicer. The document was thorough and depressing in roughly equal measure. Park had been systematic. The access code transfers had happened in stages over months, each one small enough to avoid triggering the anomaly detection systems, because Park had known how those systems worked and had known how to stay beneath their thresholds. The original construction blueprints, the ones that included the maintenance tunnel, had been transmitted 4 months before the attack, which meant the attack team had had 4 months to plan around the tunnel as a primary entry point, which meant, Mason thought, sitting with this particular fact for longer than he needed to, that the tunnel had been central to the plan from the beginning. The blast door was a known obstacle. The tunnel was supposed to be the workaround. He thought about the maintenance log he'd filed 8 months ago, the notation about the tunnel's existence. Park had been COO for the past 8 months after a promotion that put him into the exact position where he'd have had access to internal maintenance logs. The timing was not a coincidence. Mason set the document down and looked at the wall of his new office, which was bare because he hadn't put anything on it yet. He thought about Sienna's face the night they detained Park, the specific look of someone recalibrating their understanding of the past several years. He understood something about that. The recalibration, the way it worked backward through every interaction, every professional courtesy, every moment of apparent normalcy, rewriting the context. He picked up his phone and called his own personal security contact at the federal agency handling the case. He'd established the contact during the debrief because having a direct line seemed like something a director of safety and security should have. "The maintenance log," he said when the contact picked up. "The one I filed 8 months ago about the tunnel. Is it in the evidence record?" "It's in the record, yeah." Park had accessed it. "We confirmed that in week 1. "You confirmed that and nobody told me." A brief pause. "It wasn't relevant to your debrief testimony, Mr. Creed." The access log confirmed what we already knew. Park was the internal source. The specifics of how he gathered intelligence were secondary to establishing the transaction record. Mason thought about this. "Okay," he said. "I appreciate the confirmation." He hung up, sat for a moment, then stood, because sitting still with that particular information wasn't something he was going to be able to do, and walked down to the sub-level 1 corridor and did a mechanical check of the pressure sensor he'd recalibrated 3 weeks ago. Not because it needed checking, but because doing something with his hands helped him think. The sensor was reading accurately. He stood in the corridor and thought about 8 months ago, about filing that log, about not being the kind of person who left things unrecorded just because they were inconvenient to deal with, about how doing the right thing had, without his knowledge, put him in the middle of someone else's much larger wrong thing. Sienna found out he knew about the log correlation on a Wednesday afternoon, which was the day she'd blocked off for a full security review meeting with Mason and the new team. She knew because she'd read the same investigation document and had been waiting to see if he'd bring it up, which was a thing she acknowledged when he sat down across from her in the conference room. "You saw the access log confirmation," she said. "My contact at the federal office confirmed it this morning." "I should have told you directly." She said it without hedging. "I found out 2 weeks ago. I thought about how to—" She stopped. "I thought about it for too long, which is the same as not telling you." "It is," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked back. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not upset about it," he said, which wasn't entirely true but was true enough. "I'm bringing it up because it's information I need to account for in the security restructure. If the original documentation trail was compromised, I need to understand what else might be." Sienna nodded slowly. "The federal team has done a full audit of all internal documentation access for the past 18 months. Everything that Park touched is flagged." "Has that audit been shared with the board?" "Selectively." He looked at her. "Some members of the board have been more concerned about the facility's public perception than about the structural failures," she said, and there was something controlled in her voice that he recognized as restraint over something less controlled. "There's pressure to manage what becomes part of the formal record. That's a problem. I'm aware it's a problem. If the audit is incomplete in the formal record, it creates a liability that's from Mason." She said it quietly but clearly. "I know. I'm fighting that battle simultaneously with 3 others. I need you to trust that I'm fighting it." He sat with this. Outside the conference room window, the courtyard was gray with November light, and the construction crew working on the north perimeter were visible as small figures moving methodically along the fence line. "I trust that you're fighting it," he said. "I'm telling you that I need you to win it." "I know that too." The meeting proceeded. 2 hours of detailed security review, protocol assessment, gap analysis. Mason had prepared a 40-page document that he walked through section by section, and Sienna engaged with it the way she engaged with things, completely, asking precise questions, pushing back on 2 specific recommendations with counterarguments that turned out to be worth incorporating. By the end of it, the plan on the table was better than the one he'd brought in, which he hadn't fully expected but respected. "The employee access tiering," she said near the end. "You want to restructure the entire hierarchy. The current system has too many people with access to information they have operational need to see, but not strategic need to understand. Park's situation was the extreme version of a structural problem that exists at multiple levels. It'll create friction. People who currently have access feel like they're being demoted. People who currently have access created the conditions where one bad actor nearly cost this company 4 years of research and several lives." He paused. "I understand the friction. I'm telling you the friction is necessary." Sienna looked at the document, looked at him. "Implement it," she said. December moved fast. The security restructure was the primary work, and it was real work, not the policy document variety, but the kind that involved long days and concrete decisions and conversations that required Mason to be very direct with people who were not accustomed to being told their access was being reduced. There was exactly one significant blow-up, involving a senior research director named Calloway, who had held a level 4 clearance for 6 years and did not take well to finding it reviewed, and Mason handled it the same way he handled most things, directly, without apology, and with sufficient specificity that the man couldn't find a procedural angle to complain about. Calloway complained anyway, to Sienna, who told him the new protocols were non-negotiable and referred him back to the Director of Safety and Security if he had structural concerns. Mason heard about this from Oliver, who had begun relaying information with the mild conspiratorial satisfaction of someone who enjoyed watching institutional friction get resolved cleanly. "She backed you completely," Oliver said. "She didn't hedge." "I'd expect her to back the policy," Mason said. "I'd be more concerned if she felt she had to." Oliver looked at him with the expression of someone processing a distinction that was more subtle than they'd been expecting. "Right," Oliver said. Anyway, Ethan had begun asking questions about the new job. Not complex ones. Ethan's questions were generally very precise, aimed at the specific thing he wanted to know rather than the surrounding context, which Mason had always found efficient. "Do you have a uniform?" Ethan asked one evening over dinner. "Not yet. Maybe eventually." "Does it have a badge?" "I have a badge, yeah." "Can I see it?" Mason produced the facility ID with its new title printed under his name. Ethan examined it with the gravity he applied to most things, then handed it back. "Director," he said, trying out the word. "Yeah. That's higher than mechanic. It's a different job," Ethan considered. "Is it harder?" Mason thought about Calloway's complaints and the access tier restructure, and the 43-page investigation report, and the twice-weekly calls with federal investigators that were still ongoing, and the board's pressure on the documentation audit, and the fence section on Lab Wing C's exterior wall that still hadn't been replaced despite 2 formal requests. "Different hard," he said. Ethan seemed to accept this. He went back to his food and Mason watched him for a moment. The small, serious face, the dark eyes tracking something in his own thinking, and felt the ordinary weight of it, the completely unremarkable fact of a child eating dinner and a father sitting across from him, and how that specific ordinariness was the thing that made everything else worth the difficulty. It was the middle of December when Sienna stopped by the security station at the end of a long day, which she did occasionally now, not frequently enough to constitute a pattern, but often enough that Mason had stopped being surprised by it. She had her coat on, which meant she was leaving. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been managing several things simultaneously for weeks. "The board approved the documentation audit for full inclusion in the formal record," she said, without leading up to it. He looked up from the access log he'd been reviewing. "When?" "This afternoon. It was close. 3 votes. 3. 2 of the dissenting votes were from board members who have existing consulting relationships with companies that would benefit from weakened security protocols. She said it flatly. "That information is also now in the formal record, for what it's worth." Mason looked at her. "You put that in the record?" "My legal counsel did, yes, on my instruction." "That's going to make some people unhappy." "Several people are already unhappy. I've been managing their unhappiness for 6 weeks." She pulled her coat tighter, not because the room was cold, but the unconscious gesture of someone bracing. "I wanted you to know. You said you needed me to win it." "You won it," he said. She nodded, looked past him at the security station monitors for a moment. The compound perimeter, the entrance checkpoint, the interior corridor feeds that showed empty hallways in December evening light. "It looks different," she said. "The coverage pattern?" "All of it." She paused. "The facility? It feels like something I can trust again." She looked at him, then away, with the slight awkwardness of someone who'd said something more honest than they'd planned to. "That probably sounds like overstatement." "It doesn't," he said. She looked at him again, briefly. "Good night, Mason." "Good night." She left. He heard her footsteps on the corridor tile, and then the main entrance, and then nothing. He turned back to the access log. The fence section on Lab Wing C had still not been replaced. He made a note to follow up on the replacement order first thing in the morning, because the structural rating was below spec, and he'd submitted the request twice already, and twice was the last time he was going to ask. He locked the security station at 9, walked the perimeter once, a habit he'd developed without making a decision about it, the same way he'd developed the habit of double-checking the sub-level 2 corridor whenever he passed through it, and drove home. Ethan was asleep. Ruth had left another covered plate, this time pasta, and a note that said "Eat it warm" this time with no signature because she'd been leaving him notes for years and had never felt the need to sign them. He heated it up. He ate it at the counter, the way he always did, and looked at Ethan's drawings on the refrigerator. There was a new one he hadn't seen before. A figure at a desk with a small rectangle in front of it that was probably a computer or possibly a window, And above the figure, in Ethan's laborious 8-year-old handwriting, the word director. Mason stood there with a fork full of pasta halfway to his mouth and looked at it for a long time. He put the drawing in his wallet, next to the other one, where it fit surprisingly well. The fence section on Lab Wing C's exterior wall was finally replaced on the second Tuesday of January, 6 weeks after Mason's first formal request, and 4 days after he'd walked into the facility's director's office, set his third written request on the desk, and stood there without saying anything until the man picked it up and made a phone call. The crew finished the installation by mid-afternoon. Mason walked the new section personally, checking post anchors, testing tension, confirming the rating matched spec. It did. He signed off on it, logged it, and moved on to the next item on a list that had never once gotten shorter in the 2 months since he'd taken the director position, only rearranged urgent items sliding to the top, while the merely important ones held their place and waited. He was getting better at the job. This was not something he would have said out loud, but he knew it the way he knew when a repaired system was running the way it should, not from a single indicator, but from a dozen small ones that added up to a picture. The new security team was functioning. The access tier restructure had mostly settled, Calloway's continued ambient resentment notwithstanding. The federal investigation was winding toward its conclusion, with Park's cooperation accelerating the timeline. The twice-weekly calls had dropped to once a week, and the federal contact had told him, with the careful language of someone who chose their words professionally, that the evidentiary record was strong. What Mason was not getting better at was the other part of the job, the part nobody had described in the offer and that he hadn't thought to ask about, which was the sustained proximity to Sienna Vaughn. This was not a problem he knew how to categorize, which was itself a problem. It was not that she was difficult to work with. She was, in fact, the most straightforward person he'd worked for in his professional life, which covered both the military and 3 years of institutional maintenance bureaucracy. She said what she meant, she followed through on what she committed to, and when she was wrong, she said so without performing excessive self-criticism about it. She respected his judgment and didn't require him to explain his reasoning in 3 different formats before trusting it. The problem was more like, he found himself noticing things that had nothing to do with the work. The way she held a pen when she was listening to something she didn't fully agree with yet. The particular silence she got when she was thinking versus the particular silence she got when she'd already made a decision and was waiting to see if anyone else caught up. The fact that she ate lunch at her desk 4 days out of 5 and never seemed to notice she'd done it. He noticed these things and then he set them aside firmly because he was her employee and because she was the kind of person who deserved to have the people who worked for her be entirely present for the work. And because he was 37 years old with a son and a set of bruised ribs that had only recently stopped aching and enough recent complexity in his life without adding more. He was very disciplined about this. Mostly. The trial date for the 11 arrested individuals was set for late March, which meant January and February were occupied with preparation, depositions, evidence reviews, coordination with the prosecutorial team. Mason gave 2 depositions. The first was routine, a methodical walk through his timeline. The second was more targeted. The prosecutorial team wanted specific technical testimony about the maintenance tunnel, the coolant system, and the blast door, the mechanisms that had ultimately contained the breach, and they wanted it in language a jury could follow. He spent 3 days preparing for that deposition with a young attorney named Priya from the firm Sienna had retained, who asked him to explain technical systems in plain language with the patient persistence of someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that clarity was worth the time it took to achieve. "Explain the coolant system again," Priya said on the second day. "But pretend I'm someone who's never seen the inside of a building's mechanical infrastructure. That's most people." Exactly. Go." He explained it again. She stopped him twice to clarify terminology, and by the end of the third explanation, she had a version she could work with. He watched her refine it into a sentence and a half that captured the essential function without losing the accuracy, and thought that her job and his had more in common than they looked like from the outside. Both of them working with systems that had to hold under pressure, just different kinds. Sienna sat in on the second deposition preparation session, which had not been the plan, but which happened because her own deposition prep had run short, and she'd come to the conference room to find Mason and Priya still working. I'll come back, she said from the doorway. We're almost done, Priya said. You can sit in if you want. It might help to hear how we're framing the technical sequence for your own prep tomorrow. Sienna sat. Mason continued the walkthrough of the tunnel containment sequence, and he was aware of her in his peripheral vision in the way he'd become aware of her generally, not intrusively, just present, the way you were aware of a sound that was consistent enough to stop noticing consciously, but that you'd register immediately if it stopped. When he finished, Priya made notes. Sienna was looking at the table. The coolant redirect, she said, to no one specifically. You improvised that, in the moment. The system was there, Mason said. I knew what it could do. You knew what it could do under normal operating conditions. Using it as a tactical measure in a confined space with people present is... She stopped. That's not a known application. No. Were you confident it would work? He thought about it honestly. I was confident it wouldn't make things significantly worse. That's usually enough. Priya looked between them with the expression of someone who had just heard something that would be useful in a different context. That's a good line, Priya said. Can I use it? Use whatever helps, Mason said. February brought two things that arrived within the same week and occupied opposite ends of his attention. The first was Ethan's school parent-teacher conference, which Mason had scheduled and then almost rescheduled twice due to work conflicts, and ultimately attended on a Wednesday afternoon by leaving the facility at 3:30 and driving across town with his security badge still clipped to his jacket, which he noticed in the school parking lot and removed. Ethan's teacher was a woman named Mrs. Alderman, who had the demeanor of someone who had been teaching for long enough to have genuine opinions and didn't particularly need to qualify them. He's doing well, she said. Academically, very well. His math is strong. His reading is above grade level. She paused. He's also very contained, which isn't necessarily a problem, but I want to make sure you're aware of it. Contained, Mason said. He watches a lot. He doesn't push into group situations the way some kids do. He waits. She looked at Mason directly. He's been like this since he joined our class. I don't know his full history, but I have a sense he's practiced at being the steady one. For his age. Mason looked at his hands. His mother passed away 4 years ago, he said. He was 4. Mrs. Alderman nodded. That would do it. She said it without sentimentality, which Mason appreciated. He's a good kid. He's happy, as far as I can tell. I just want you to know that he carries more than kids his age typically carry, and he carries it quietly. Mason drove home from that conference with something sitting in his chest that he couldn't name exactly. Not guilt, not quite, more like the specific ache of understanding something that had been in front of him, and that he'd been seeing clearly all along, and somehow also not clearly enough. He called Ruth that evening and talked to her for an hour, which was longer than they usually talked. She said some of the same things Mrs. Alderman had said, but differently, with the warmth of someone who'd been watching Ethan since he was born, and who had her own relationship with grief, and who understood, without needing to discuss it, the particular way that love and loss got tangled in children. He knows you love him, Ruth said. I know he knows. That's not always enough, she said. Sometimes they need to see you present in a way that has nothing to do with being useful. Mason thought about this for a long time after he hung up. About the word useful, about how much of his life in the past 4 years had been organized around that concept. Being useful, being functional, being the one who showed up and did what needed doing and came home. He took Ethan out that Saturday, just the two of them, to a small science museum across town that Ethan had mentioned once 3 months ago, and that Mason had filed away and then gotten too busy to act on. They spent 4 hours there. Ethan talked almost continuously, which was unusual. Normally he was the one who listened. And Mason learned more about the specific mechanics of orbital spaceflight than he had acquired in the previous 37 years of his life. In the car on the way home, Ethan fell asleep. Mason drove in the quiet and thought about Mrs. Alderman's word. Contained. He thought, you come by it honestly, kid. The second thing that February brought arrived on a Thursday, in the form of a phone call from the federal contact that Mason took in his office with the door closed. We have a development, the contact said. It's not a problem. It's actually the opposite of a problem, but it's going to affect the timeline. and I wanted you to hear it directly before it hits the formal channels. Okay. Two of the three individuals who weren't in custody at the time of the initial arrests. We've located both. One turned himself into a consulate overseas yesterday. The other was detained at a border crossing 2 days ago. A pause. The third individual, the one who coordinated the external contracting for the operation, we have a confirmed location. The arrest is expected within the next 72 hours. Mason let this settle. Who's the third? The operational coordinator, not the buyer. The buyer is a separate thread we're still working. The coordinator is a professional, someone who arranges these kinds of operations for organizations that want deniability. The contact paused. His arrest will effectively close the active threat to your facility. The buyer is a longer-term investigation, but without the coordinator, the operational capability is significantly degraded. Significantly. I understand that's not completely. No, it's not. Mason looked at his office wall. Still bare, because he still hadn't put anything on it. What's the exposure window between now and the arrest? We're asking you to maintain current protocols, no changes. If he or anyone connected to him is monitoring the facility, we don't want indicators that suggest we're close. Understood. I'll contact you the moment the arrest is confirmed. Mason thanked him and hung up, and then he sat very still in his office for about 30 seconds, and then he got up and went to find Sienna. She was in the lab wing, as it happened. She spent time there most days, working alongside the research team, with an ease that suggested she'd never entirely stopped thinking of herself as a researcher first. He found her in the main laboratory with Patricia Osei, both of them looking at something on a screen that Mason didn't try to understand. "Can I speak with you?" he said, from the doorway. She looked up, read his face. She was, he'd noticed, very good at reading faces, a skill that probably made her excellent at her job and that he'd stopped trying to be neutral around because it was a futile effort. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. It was actually 3 minutes, and they went to her office, and he told her what the contact had told him. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 72 hours, she said, approximately. "And until then, we hold current protocols." "Yes." She nodded, looked at the window. Outside, the January compound was gray and still, the construction crew long gone, the perimeter fence solid and properly rated and exactly what it should be. "How are you handling it?" she asked. The question caught him slightly off guard, which he didn't show. "Fine." "Mason." He looked at her. "I'm asking because I want to know, not because it's a protocol question." She said it with the directness that he'd come to expect from her, but there was something else underneath it, something more careful, like she'd thought about whether to ask and decided to go ahead. "I'm handling it fine," he said. "It's the right direction. I want it closed." There's a difference between wanting something closed because it's the right outcome and wanting it closed because you're... She stopped, started again. "You've been carrying the active threat assessment for 5 months. That's a real weight. I don't want you to..." Another stop. "To what?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who'd gotten further into a sentence than they'd planned. "To pretend it hasn't cost anything," she said. "You do that." The room was quiet. Outside the window, nothing moved. "So do you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and there was something in the way she did it. Not dismissive, more like the look of someone absorbing an accurate thing. "Yes," she said. "I do." The arrest came in 61 hours, not 72. Mason was at his desk reviewing the month-end access audit when the call came through at 6:47 in the morning. "Confirmed," the contact said. "He's in custody. Local authorities coordinated with our team. No incidents." "Understood, thank you. The active threat designation for your facility has been formally downgraded. Standard monitoring from here. You'll receive the official documentation through legal channels by end of week." Mason thanked him and hung up. He sat for a moment. The early morning facility was quiet. First shift was just coming on, and the security station outside his office was transitioning between the overnight team and the day team, voices low, the routine passing of information that was the baseline sound of the place functioning the way it was supposed to. He texted Sienna, "Arrest confirmed. Active threat designation downgraded. Full documentation coming by Friday." The reply came 4 minutes later. Thank you. Come find me when you have a minute. He found her in the administrative corridor outside her office, which she was apparently just arriving at, coat still on, a coffee cup from somewhere off-site in her hand, her phone in the other. She'd read the text in her car, probably, or in the elevator. She looked at him when he came down the corridor, and her expression did something complicated and then settled. It's over, she said. The active phase, he said. I know the trial is still pending. She said it without impatience. She stopped. I can walk through this building without calculating exits. He understood that. He understood it specifically, the way it lived in the body. Yeah, he said, it's over. She nodded. They stood in the corridor for a moment, her with her coat on, him with the security badge that still occasionally surprised him when he caught his own reflection, both of them in the specific silence of people who had been managing something difficult for a long time and had just been told they could stop. I want to do something, Sienna said, for the staff, the ones who were in the facility that night. She'd been thinking about this. He could tell it wasn't a new thought, a formal acknowledgement, not a press release, not something for the company's public record, something that's for them. What did you have in mind? I don't entirely know yet. I've been thinking about it since November. She looked at her coffee cup, then at him. I've also been thinking about something more specific, something that has to do with you. He waited. Claire, she said. She said the name carefully, the way people said names they knew were weighted. I've been thinking about the scholarship. He went still. I should have talked to you about it first, she said immediately. I know that. I've been drafting it in my head for 3 months, and I kept not bringing it up because I wasn't sure how to. And that's not an excuse, it's just true. She looked at him directly. I want to establish a scholarship in her name for children from single-parent families pursuing engineering or technology. Through the company foundation. A pause. But I need to know that it's what you'd want, not what I've decided is meaningful. The corridor was empty except for them. The facility's morning sounds were starting up. The distant hum of equipment, the opening of doors, footsteps. Mason looked at the wall across from him, the bare institutional surface of it, which told him nothing. She went back to school when Ethan was 2, he said. Finished her master's while he was in diapers. She was in the middle of applying for her doctorate when He stopped. Started again. She used to say that the hardest thing about being a parent wasn't the time. It was the math. What you had and what you needed and how much of it was luck versus work. He paused. She knew a lot about the luck part going wrong. Sienna was very quiet. A scholarship, he said. Yeah, I think that's what she'd have wanted. I'll put it together properly, Sienna said, and I'll show it to you before anything is finalized, every detail. He nodded. They stood in the corridor for another moment. Go get your coffee warmed up, he said. That one's been cold for 20 minutes. She looked at the cup in her hand like she'd genuinely forgotten it was there. It has, she agreed. She went into her office. He went back toward the security station, passing through the lobby where the morning light was coming in at a low winter angle through the entrance glass. And he thought about Claire, the way she laughed when she was genuinely surprised, which was a specific laugh, different from her regular one. The way she'd looked at Ethan the first time she held him, like she'd solved a problem she hadn't known she was working on. He thought about Ethan's drawing on the refrigerator, the figure at the desk with the word director above it. He thought about Mrs. Alderman saying he carries more than kids his age typically carry, and he carries it quietly. He reached the security station and nodded to the day shift team as they settled into position. He checked the overnight log, clean, routine, no anomalies, and signed off on the shift handover. It was a Thursday, an ordinary Thursday in February, with ordinary work on the list and ordinary sounds filling the building, and no one in Lab Wing C calculating exits. He sat down at his desk and started on the day. The trial began on a Tuesday in late March, which arrived the way significant dates tend to arrive, preceded by weeks of anticipation, and then suddenly, without ceremony, just another morning with the alarm going off at 6, and Ethan needing breakfast and the drive to the courthouse through ordinary traffic on ordinary roads. Mason wore a jacket he didn't own 6 months ago, because Ruth had taken one look at the jacket he'd planned to wear and driven him to a store without asking. He sat in the prosecution's designated seating and watched the courtroom fill, and thought about how strange it was that the most significant external event of his life in the past several years had resulted in this: a room with fluorescent lighting and wood paneling, and a clerk arranging documents with the focused efficiency of someone who did this every day because they did. Sienna was 2 rows ahead of him. She'd arrived before he had, which didn't surprise him. She sat with the company's legal team, Priya on her right, 2 other attorneys flanking, and she held herself the way she always held herself in professional contexts: straight, contained, present. She'd glanced back once when he came in, a brief acknowledgement, and then returned her attention to the front of the room. The 11 defendants entered in stages. Mason watched them without particular feeling. He'd processed most of what he was going to process about the night of the incident over the preceding months, in the small hours and in the sub-level corridors and in depositions and in the ordinary daily work of making sure the thing that had happened couldn't happen again. What sat in the courtroom wasn't resolution. Resolution was a word people used for things that were tidier than this, but something more like the formal acknowledgement that the reckoning was real. Gerald Park was not in the courtroom. His cooperation agreement had separated his proceedings from the group trial, a fact that Mason had been told about in advance, and that still landed with a particular weight when the defendants were enumerated and his name wasn't among them. 11 people who had followed orders, and the man who had given the information that made those orders possible, sitting in a different courthouse making a different kind of accounting. The trial ran 4 days. Mason testified on the second day for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Priya had prepared him well, and the technical testimony went the way it was supposed to go: clear, specific, grounded in what he'd actually observed and done rather than in what it had felt like. The defense attorney cross-examined him for 35 minutes and found very little purchase, because Mason had spent 3 decades learning how to be precise under pressure, and the courtroom was not the most pressurized room he'd ever testified in. Sienna testified on the 3rd day. He watched her from the same seat, and he watched the jury watch her, 12 people who had been strangers to each other 6 months ago and were now required to agree on something complicated together, and he thought that she was very good at this. Not performed good, not polished good, but the specific good of someone who understood that the most persuasive thing was accuracy delivered without ornamentation. She described the night of the incident, the vehicles entering the compound, the security team leaving, the blast door. She described the moment of realizing Park was the source of the breach, with the particular steadiness of someone who had had months to metabolize it and was now reporting it as a fact rather than an injury. The defense attorney asked her, "Ms. Vaughn, isn't it true that the security failures that night were ultimately a result of inadequate corporate oversight rather than the actions of the defendants?" Sienna looked at the attorney for a moment. "The security failures that night were the result of deliberate exploitation by people who were paid to exploit them," she said. "The corporate oversight failures are also real, and we've been correcting them for 6 months. Both things are true simultaneously." The attorney moved on. Mason thought, 3 votes on the board, 61 hours, 4 days of trial. He thought about all the ways things could have gone differently. The verdicts came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all primary counts for 9 of the 11 defendants. The remaining 2, lower-level operatives whose roles had been substantially diminished by the testimony, received lesser findings on reduced charges. It was not a complete sweep, and Priya had prepared them both for the possibility of a partial outcome, but it was close enough that the prosecutorial team was satisfied. And when Mason walked out of the courthouse into the late March air, he felt something in his chest release that he hadn't been entirely aware he was holding. Sienna came out 2 minutes after him. The legal team was behind her, and there were a few journalists near the courthouse steps who'd been covering the trial, and she handled the brief question cluster with the efficient grace of someone who had issued a prepared statement and was politely declining to expand on it. When she got to the bottom of the steps and the journalists had retreated, she found Mason standing near the parking structure entrance and stopped. 9, she said. 9, he agreed. She looked at the street. Afternoon traffic, people going about their Friday, the world entirely indifferent to the 4 days that had just concluded inside that building. "Park's sentencing is next month," she said. "I know. I won't be there for that one." He looked at her. "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been thinking about what it costs to keep attending," she said. "Not legally, I'm not required, but personally." She glanced at him. I spent 5 months making decisions based on what had happened in that building. I'd like to start spending more time making decisions based on what's happening in it now. He thought about Mrs. Alderman, about the word contained, about Ruth saying sometimes they need to see you present in a way that has nothing to do with being useful. That's probably right, he said. She looked at him in the afternoon light. Are you going to park sentencing? I haven't decided. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. They stood there on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, both of them in jackets that were slightly too light for the March air, and he thought about how much of the past 7 months had been shaped by a night that lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes, how it had changed the job he had, and the people around him, and the specific contents of his wallet, and the drawing on his refrigerator door. Come on, Sienna said. I'll buy you a coffee. A real one, not the machine in my office. That machine costs more than my first car. And it makes terrible coffee, I know. Come on. They found a place 3 blocks from the courthouse. Unremarkable. The kind of coffee shop that existed to serve people who needed caffeine between obligations rather than an experience. They sat at a corner table. Sienna ordered black coffee, and Mason ordered the same because he didn't feel like making a different decision. The scholarship is ready, she said. Legally finalized last week. The foundation approved it in February, but the paperwork takes the time it takes. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The first cycle opens for applications next month. Engineering and technology, single-parent household requirement, no GPA floor, just demonstrated interest and financial need. No GPA floor, he said. Claire went back to school with a 4-year-old. She wasn't going to have a 4.0. The people this scholarship is for aren't the ones who had every advantage and still did well. They're the ones who did it anyway. She looked at him. That was the intent. I wanted to make sure I got it right. He looked at his coffee. You got it right, he said. She nodded. Something in her expression, not relief exactly, more like the settling of something that had been suspended. I want to tell you something, she said, and I want to say it correctly, which means I might be slow about it. He waited. He was good at waiting. When this started, she paused, recalibrated. When you walked into that laboratory 7 months ago, you were a person I knew by name from a facilities directory. Maintenance. 3rd floor leaky faucets, annual HVAC inspection, the man who left accurate repair logs and asked for things in writing. She almost smiled. I used to see your maintenance notifications in my inbox and think at least someone in this building documents things properly. Patricia Osei told me the same thing once, he said. Patricia has good judgment. She set her cup down. What I'm trying to say is that I've worked with a lot of people over the past 7 months who were managing a crisis. Some of them were managing it for the company. Some of them were managing it for themselves. You were doing something different. She stopped. You were just handling what was in front of you every time, without making it about anything other than what it was. He didn't say anything. I found that... She stopped again, and he could see her working, choosing, deciding how far to take the sentence. I found it remarkable. I still do. The coffee shop was filling up with the end-of-day crowd. People in work clothes, a couple near the window, a man at the counter typing on a laptop with the focused urgency of someone on a deadline. Normal Friday afternoon in a city that had no particular reason to think about Blackstone Horizon or any of the things that had happened there. Sienna, he said. She looked at him. I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed that this conversation is becoming something different from a professional debrief. She held his gaze. No, she said, I'm not pretending that either. I work for you. You do. That's a real consideration. It is, she agreed. I'm not unaware of it. She looked at her cup, then back at him. I'm also not suggesting we do anything that creates a problem we haven't solved yet. I'm just... She paused. I'm being honest with you, because you've been honest with me consistently for 7 months, and it seemed reciprocal. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back steadily, the way she did most things, without flinching from the outcome of it. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They finished their coffee. They walked back to the parking structure in the late afternoon air that had gotten slightly colder. The city doing what cities did in the early days of spring, arguing with itself about whether winter was actually finished. He drove home. She drove wherever she drove. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been started. Something had been acknowledged, which was different from both of those things, and, in its way, more important than either. He didn't attend Park's sentencing. He made this decision not dramatically, but practically. Sitting at his desk on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the date, and looking at the scheduling conflict with a security audit, he'd already moved twice, and deciding that the audit was the thing that needed to happen, and the sentencing was a thing that would happen without him. He did read the outcome, which came through the federal contact that afternoon. 17 years, reduced from the prosecutorial recommendation in exchange for the cooperation agreement, with specific provisions about the evidentiary record that Mason read twice and then set down. 17 years. He sat with that number and tried to find the feeling it was supposed to produce and found something more complicated. Not satisfaction, not insufficient justice, more like the acknowledgement that no number was going to make the equation come out even. 11 years Park had been with the company. 17 years was what came after. The math of consequence was never clean. He texted Sienna. Park sentenced. 17 years. Full details through legal. Her reply, I know. Priya called. Are you okay? He thought about it. Yeah. You? Working on it. He put the phone in his desk drawer and went back to the audit. The thing about rebuilding something was that it didn't announce itself as rebuilt. There was no moment where Mason could point to the Blackstone Horizon facility and say, there, that's the finished version. Security systems didn't work that way. Buildings didn't work that way. The work was continuous, finding the weak point, addressing it, finding the next one. The fence got replaced and something else needed attention. The access tier restructure settled and someone discovered a gap in the visitor protocol. The tunnel was sealed and the documentation audit was complete and the active threat designation was downgraded, and still every morning Mason came in and looked at what needed doing and did it. He had stopped thinking of this as frustrating somewhere around January. He had started thinking of it as simply the nature of the work, that good systems weren't finished things but ongoing things, requiring someone to pay attention and to stay honest about what they saw rather than what they wanted to see. This felt, to him, like a true thing that applied beyond security protocols. He wasn't sure he could have articulated it clearly before the past 7 months, but something about the work had clarified it. The night of the incident had not been the story. It was the thing that preceded the story. The story was the 7 months after, the months of looking at what had broken and deciding what to do about it and doing it imperfectly and then doing it again. Ethan had his 9th birthday in April. Mason took him to the Science Museum again because Ethan had asked to go back, and they spent the afternoon moving through it differently this time, more slowly, Ethan leading, stopping at the things that interested him rather than moving through comprehensively. He'd developed specific opinions since the last visit. He had strong views about orbital mechanics and very considered thoughts about materials science, which he explained to Mason in the patient, slightly professorial tone of a child who had been reading about things and was ready to discuss them. Mom studied materials science, Mason said at one point. Ethan stopped, looked up at him. I know you know, Mason said. I just wanted to say it. Ethan was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was processing something. Then he said, do you think she would have worked here, at a place like this? Maybe. Probably somewhere like it. Making the energy thing? Or something related. She liked problems that had a lot of parts. Ethan considered the exhibit in front of them, a display about composite materials, their structure and applications, diagrams and cross-sections, and a small sample case with physical examples. He looked at it for a while. I think I want to do something like this, he said, when I'm older. Mason looked at him. Like what? Build things, figure out why they break and make them not break. He paused. Or figure out new things that work better than old things. Engineering. Or close enough. That's good work, Mason said. I know, Ethan said with the complete confidence of a 9-year-old who had decided something. Then he moved on to the next exhibit, because the decision had been made and there was more to see. Mason stood at the composite materials display for a moment longer. He thought about Claire, the way she'd stood in front of problems, methodically, patiently, with the quiet certainty of someone who trusted that things could be understood if you looked at them long enough and from the right angle. He thought, he has your eyes and your patience, and apparently your vocation. He thought, I hope you're seeing this. He moved on to catch up with Ethan. In May, the first Clare Creed Scholarship recipients were announced. 7 of them, the first cohort, ranging from 18 to 32 from 5 different states, studying fields that ranged from mechanical engineering to computer science to environmental technology. Sienna's foundation sent Mason a brief bio for each one, which he read at his kitchen counter on a Tuesday evening while Ethan was doing homework at the table behind him. One of them was 26, a mother of a 2-year-old, finishing her degree in environmental engineering at a state school while working part-time at a utility company. Her application essay, which the foundation had shared a portion of, talked about calculating what she had against what she needed, and deciding that the math would never be right if she waited for it to be right first. Mason set the folder down on the counter and looked at the refrigerator. Ethan's drawing was still there, the figure at the desk with director above it, slightly wrinkled now from being relocated twice when Ethan updated other drawings around it. It had become, without discussion, a permanent fixture. The kind of thing that stays because no one decides to move it, and eventually it becomes part of the landscape. He turned around. How's the homework? Hard, Ethan said. Which part? The fractions part. Mason sat down across from him and looked at the worksheet. Show me. They worked through it together for 40 minutes. Ethan frustrated twice. Mason patient in the specific way that was harder than the patience he brought to the facility, because Ethan's frustration was more difficult to sit with than any security gap he'd ever identified. By the end, Ethan had gotten through the worksheet and understood most of it, and was satisfied in the grudging way of someone who'd fought for something and gotten it. Fractions are dumb, Ethan said. They seem dumb until you need them. When do you need them? Mason thought about hydraulic systems, pressure ratios, load-bearing calculations for structural modifications. More often than you'd think, he said. But he and Sienna had dinner in late May. Not a work dinner. There was no agenda, no debrief, no legal matter pending. He'd asked her, on a Wednesday afternoon after a security review meeting, whether she wanted to get dinner sometime, and she'd said yes without hesitating, which was either significant or just characteristic of how she made decisions, and he'd decided the distinction could wait. They went to a restaurant neither of them had been to. His suggestion, because he'd noticed it on a drive and it had looked like the kind of place that didn't try too hard, which was his primary criterion for restaurants when he wasn't taking Ethan somewhere that needed to have chicken fingers on the menu. It was the first time he'd seen her entirely outside a work context. No badge, no Oliver waiting nearby, no whiteboard equations in the background. She wore a dark green sweater that was not a blazer and ordered something from the menu she'd clearly never had before and seemed pleased with it. And she talked about things that had nothing to do with Blackstone Horizon for most of the first hour. She talked about growing up in the Southwest, the flat specific light of it, a father who'd been an electrician and who'd given her a circuit kit when she was 6 and apparently set the entire trajectory of her life without meaning to. She talked about the year between finishing her doctorate and starting at Blackstone, a year she'd spent traveling, not directionlessly but with a specific intention to see things that couldn't be seen from inside a laboratory, which had included 2 months in Southeast Asia and a month in Iceland and a period in between that she described as complicated without elaborating. You don't talk about yourself much, she said at one point. In general, I talk. When you're asked, you don't volunteer. She looked at him with the curiosity she brought to most things. Genuine, not interrogative. Why did you join the Navy? He thought about it. My father, he said, he was career military. Not the Navy, Army, but the structure. I understood it because I grew up inside it. He paused. And because I was 20 and I needed something that would tell me what to do with the amount of energy I had. Did it work? For a while. Then I met Claire and it stopped being the most important thing. What was she like? He'd been asked this question many times over 4 years in many different contexts by well-meaning people who wanted to say the right thing, by Ethan's teachers and doctors, and by Danny with his characteristic bluntness. He'd developed a version of the answer that was accurate and complete, and that didn't cost him more than he had available to give. He looked at Sienna across the table and thought about the version he usually gave and gave a different one instead. She was impatient, he said, not with people, with inefficiency. She hated wasted process. She'd walk into a situation, identify the 3 things that needed to change, and have a hard time pretending to care about the things that didn't. He paused. She was better at pretending than she thought she was, but she still hated it. Another pause. She was extremely funny, which people didn't always expect because she was very serious about her work, but she had this very dry. She could make you laugh in the middle of something difficult, and it didn't undermine the difficulty. It just made it possible to keep going. Sienna was listening with the full attention she gave things. She sounds like someone worth missing, she said. Yeah, he said. She is. The restaurant was warm, crowded in the comfortable way of a place with good food and no reservation system, and the noise around them was the undifferentiated sound of people in conversations that mattered to them and nobody else. I don't know how to do this, Mason said. For the record, Sienna looked at him. Do what? This. He gestured, meaning the table, the restaurant, the dinner that was not a work dinner. I haven't done this it's been a long time. And the last time I did it, I was 24 and significantly less complicated. I'm 31 and significantly more complicated than I look, she said. We're probably even. You still employ me. I'm aware. She held his gaze. I've thought about that. If it becomes a problem, we figure out the problem. I'm not interested in avoiding something real because of something structural that can be addressed. She paused. But I'm also not asking you to be certain of anything. I'm not certain of anything. I'm just here, at dinner, with you. He looked at her. That's enough, he said. For now, that's enough. She nodded. They finished dinner. He drove her back to where she'd parked. They'd met at the restaurant, and when they said goodnight on the sidewalk, it was with the specific plainness of 2 people who had acknowledged something true and were willing to let it be true at its own pace. He drove home with the windows down despite the cool May air, because the night was clear and the drive was short and he was 37 years old, and something had shifted in a way that wasn't dramatic but was real. Summer came early that year. By June, the compound's exterior was green in a way that made the fence repairs and the sealed tunnel entrance look like simply what they were, parts of the facility's landscape, ongoing maintenance, the ordinary evidence of a place that was being taken care of. Mason had a conversation with Ruth in June that he'd been putting off for 6 months about what the next year looked like, about the job and Ethan's school, and the specific practical logistics of a life that had quietly changed without anyone making a formal announcement about it. Ruth listened to all of it and then said, You seem different. Different how? Like you've decided something. He thought about it. I think I've decided to stop organizing everything around what might go wrong. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing. For you. No, he agreed. Claire would have said it took you long enough. Probably. She also would have said it's good that you got there. Ruth paused. She said that once, actually, about you specifically, that you'd always get there. It would just take you a while. He sat with this. She said that about me? Before Ethan, when you were still adjusting to everything. She said, he always gets there, he just needs to arrive on his own. He looked out Ruth's kitchen window at the yard where Ethan was doing something involving a stick and a hypothesis about the aerodynamics of different throwing angles. She was right, he said. She usually was, Ruth said, with the wry certainty of a woman who had raised her. On the 1-year anniversary of the incident, a Thursday in August, Mason arrived at work at his usual time, did his morning perimeter check, reviewed the overnight log, had a disagreement with a facilities contractor about a ventilation specification that Mason won because he was right, and had the documentation to prove it, ate lunch at his desk because the alternative was eating it in the cafeteria where 2 different people would want to talk about the anniversary, and he wasn't interested in observing it that way. At 4 in the afternoon, Sienna knocked on his open office door. He looked up. I thought you had the board call until 5, he said. It ran short. She leaned against the doorframe. I wanted to check in. I'm fine. I know you're fine. I wanted to check in anyway. He looked at her for a moment. She was wearing the same kind of expression she'd had at the coffee shop in March, the one that meant she'd decided to be honest rather than careful. How are you? He asked. I'm better than I was a year ago, she said, which is not the same as being straightforwardly okay, but it's true. She paused. I've been thinking today about the blast door, about the sound it made when it closed. He remembered it. The deep hydraulic resonance through the floor, the certainty of it. I've been thinking, she said, that I've spent a year building things that will hold. The security system, the protocols, the documentation, the scholarship. She paused. And I think it's working. I think things are holding. She looked at him. I wanted to tell you that, because you built most of it. We built most of it, he said. She didn't argue. Yes, she said. We did. He stood up from his desk. It was 4 p.m. on a Thursday in August, 1 year from the night that had changed things, and the facility was running, and the research was intact, and somewhere in a state school an environmental engineering student was finishing her degree while raising a 2-year-old, partly on a scholarship with a name that Mason carried in his chest rather than on a plaque. You want to take a walk? He said. The perimeter, before I close out for the day. She looked at him. I'm not exactly dressed for a perimeter walk. You've done worse in a crisis. The corner of her mouth moved. Fair point. They went outside. The August evening was warm, the compound's exterior lit by the long, late summer light that turned everything amber in particular, and they walked the perimeter the way Mason always walked it, without urgency, paying attention, covering the ground that needed covering. He showed her the replaced fence section on Lab Wing C, properly anchored, tension-rated, holding. She ran her hand along the top rail the way engineers handled things, checking. Good work, she said. Took long enough, he said. They walked the rest of it. The sealed tunnel entrance on the north side, a flush concrete panel in the earth that looked like nothing. The exterior of Lab Wing C where the window had blown in. The access road where the black SUVs had been. None of it was dramatic. It was just a building, in the evening light, doing what buildings did, standing, containing, going about the quiet work of being useful to the people inside it. At the far edge of the perimeter, near the east fence, they stopped. The city was visible in the distance, lights coming on as the sun dropped, the ordinary evening machinery of a place full of people managing their lives. My son wants to be an engineer, Mason said. Sienna looked at him. Does he? Materials science, maybe. He hasn't decided. He's 9. He has time. He does. Mason looked at the city. He's going to be better at it than either of us, probably. He has his mother's patience and her instincts and her way of looking at problems. He paused. He also has her stubbornness, which is going to make things interesting. Stubbornness isn't the worst thing, Sienna said. No, in the right person, it's the best thing. She looked at him with the expression he'd been learning to read for months, the one that was a half second ahead of what she said next, where you could see her deciding to go ahead. Tell me something about Claire, she said. Something small, that you haven't told anyone else. He thought about it, really thought about it, not the versions he'd told before. She couldn't fold a map, he said, not even close. She was a materials scientist with a near-perfect spatial memory who could look at a building structure and identify failure points in 60 seconds, and she could not fold a paper map back to its original form, not once in her life. She'd try for a while, and then she'd just, he made a gesture, crumple it and put it in the glove compartment. Sienna laughed. Not the polite version, the actual one, surprised, brief, genuine. That's very specific, she said. Maps in the glove compartment, he said. I still find them sometimes, in the old car. The laughter settled into something quieter. They stood in the amber light at the edge of the perimeter, and the city glittered in the distance, and neither of them said anything for a while in the comfortable way of people who didn't need the silence to mean something other than what it was. Eventually Mason said, I should close out for the day. You should, she agreed. They walked back. He did his end-of-shift routine, log review, security station handover, the brief check of the overnight protocol with the evening team. Sienna went back to her office for whatever remained on her list, because there was always something remaining on her list. He drove home through the August evening, windows down, the air warm and specific and smelling of summer and the city doing its end-of-day negotiation with itself. He picked Ethan up from Ruth's, where they were in the backyard with a cardboard tube that had apparently become central to an aerodynamics experiment that Ruth was very patient about and that had involved a small dent in the siding, which Ethan reported with the forthright guilty accuracy of a kid who'd learned that honesty was better than getting caught. "We'll fix it," Mason said. "I know how to fix it," Ethan said. "I already looked it up." Mason looked at him. "You looked up siding repair." "I wanted to know if it was hard." "Is it?" "Not really. You need a patch kit and something called a J-channel." He paused. "I don't know what a J-channel is, but the video said it wasn't expensive." "I know what a J-channel is," Mason said. Ethan looked at him with the expression that meant he wanted to know and also was already composing the follow-up question. "We'll fix it Saturday," Mason said. "I'll show you." That night, after Ethan was in bed, Mason sat at the kitchen counter and looked at the refrigerator. Ethan's drawings, accumulated over months, a layered record of a 9-year-old's evolving interests and improving motor skills, rockets getting more aerodynamically accurate, figures getting proper proportions, the director figure still there in its place of honor. He thought about what it meant to keep a promise every morning. He thought it didn't mean no nights went wrong, or that the thing you were protecting never had to be fought for. He thought it meant showing up the next morning after the night that went wrong, and the morning after that, and that the accumulation of those mornings was what the promise actually was, not a single heroic moment, but the long, imperfect, ordinary faithfulness of someone who decided to stay. He thought about Claire's unfolded maps in the glove compartment, about Ethan's patient orbital mechanics explanations, about Sienna's face in the amber light at the edge of the perimeter, about the blast door closing with its deep, certain resonance and the work that came after, and the fence that finally held. He thought, this is the thing nobody talks about when they talk about strength. It's not the night you stand up when everyone else runs. That's real, but it's 4 hours. The strength that counts is the 365 days around it, the maintenance, the repair, the choosing to be present when presence is hard and unglamorous and doesn't get remembered. The drawing on the refrigerator was a figure at a desk, and the desk was ordinary, and the word above it said director, and the wrench in the figure's hand was probably not accurate to the current job description, but was accurate to something more important. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The facility was running. The research was safe. Somewhere in 5 states, 7 people were working towards something that would outlast the crisis that had made it possible. A 9-year-old who would one day understand J-channels and composite materials and the specific geometry of things that hold was asleep in the next room, caring more than his age suggested and doing it quietly, the way he'd learned. And Mason Creed, former Navy SEAL, former maintenance mechanic, director of safety and security, father of one, man who drove home with the windows down on warm August nights, woke up the next morning and the one after that and kept showing up. That was the whole of it. That was enough.